Welcome to the fourth part of the Todo App built using SpringBoot. And let me give you a quick summary of what we have done in part 1, 2, and 3. In part 1, we have developed the task service, which contains the task-related endpoints, like the endpoint, the post endpoint for creation of the task, the get, put, and the delete endpoint for retrieval of the task. And note that all these endpoints have been created using the best practices of REST naming, which means that the endpoint names are nouns and the HTTP actions are the verbs. And then the part 2 dealt with creation of the user and verification of user credential. And in part 3, we saw how we created the jot during user credentials endpoint. Once the user credentials are authenticated, then the jot is created. And then we saw that how there was a jot interceptor, which actually intercepted all endpoints, which actually intercepted all tasks related endpoints and validated the jot. And if the jot was valid, then only it delegated the call to the task endpoint, else it threw back an HTTP forbidden response. So that is a summary of what we have done in part 1, 2, and 3, and there are the videos for 1, 2, and 3 respectively, and please go through them if you have not gone through them. In this part, I'm going to show you how we can do a testing, both unit and integration testing of the same app, because it's very important to do the tests, because tests are the things which actually give me an assurance that my app is running fine when I'm still making changes, functional changes, fixing bugs. And then of course the best way or the easiest and the quickest way to know that my app is still running fine is to run the tests. Okay, so we will do 2 rounds of testing. One is a unit testing. Unit testing is basically testing individual classes, like testing the controller or the service classes using JUnit and using Mockito for mocking. So what we do in unit testing is we actually mock the dependency. Say for example, if we are testing the controller layer, then we mock the service layer, which is a dependency. And in integration testing, we actually run the entire app, which means we actually start the Spring Boot server and then send requests to the HTTP endpoints and then check with the response. So the integration testing are kind of an end-to-end testing in this case. So let us now go and see how we can do this testing by actually looking at the code base and running the tests. With the demo, again, please go to my GitHub repository, and the link to my GitHub repository is mentioned in the description. So please find out the link from the description, and note that the branch for this particular demo is Todo App Part 4. So that is the branch. I have already cloned the branch locally, and if you go within the test folder, then you will see that I have created some sample tests for the controller layer test and the service layer test. So this controller and the service layer test are the unit test. So let us go ahead and see the example of that. Maybe the controller layer test. So you will see that I have used JUnit 5, which is JUnit Jupyter. And so in the controller layer, all the dependencies on the controller layer, which is the service layer, has been mocked. And so only a very simple test has been done, just for demonstration. So I'm creating a user object, and then I'm actually invoking the create user method of the controller layer, which is supposed to invoke the create user layer of the service method. But I have already done a stubbing of that, because the service layer is mocked and the service layer is actually not a valid object, it's a mocked object. So if you call any method on the mocked object, it will give null. So in order to avoid that, we'll have to do some stubbing or mocking. So I have done some stubbing here. So I'm saying that when user service.create user is called with any user class, then do nothing. So this line is essential, because without this line, the service layer, the service layer will throw a null pointer exception. So then the controller layer is called, and then finally I'm verifying that the service layer is indeed invoked only once when the controller layer is called. So this is how we typically do unit testing. We mock the dependency. In this case, the dependency is a service layer, and then we do a stubbing of the dependency. And this is the stubbing of the dependency. We are saying that when the service layer's method create user is called, then do nothing, and then we call the target method, which is this, and finally we do some verification or some assertion, which is this. So that is a typical example of the unit test. And here also in the service layer, I'm also doing some unit tests to verify the creation of the jot, to verify the hashing of the password, and to also verify if a jot is generated. So for all this, for for all this also unit testing is done, and in this unit testing also, as you can see, that the DAO layer is the dependency on the service layer, and hence the DAO layer is mocked here. The RSA key generation cannot be mocked, so that is why real objects were created. And if you run any of these methods, then you will see that they are running successfully. For example, if you look at this particular method, then you will see that here we are calling the user service.generate jot, and then the jot is generated, and then we are actually verifying the claims within the jot. So that is how we are doing unit testing here. And in this unit testing, there is a bit of mix of the mocked object, which is the DAO layer object, and the actual objects, which are the RSA keys. Because we had to do this because mocking the RSA keys and the JWS signer, although possible, can be a little bit cumbersome. Now, these are examples of unit testing. Let us go ahead and see the example of the integration testing, which is the end-to-end testing. And here we are actually starting the Spring Boot server. And let's see what are the tests which I have done. The first test is always in an integration testing in Spring Boot, you should have a test like this, which checks if the Spring Boot server comes up properly. So this should be a very basic integration test for any Spring Boot test. Remember that we can actually run Spring Boot test using this annotation at Spring Boot test and using a random port. Using of random port is recommended because you do not know, like wherever you are running this integration test, maybe in a cloud environment as part of a pipeline, then what port is available or not, you do not know. So that is why it is always better to use a random port. Now here I am checking verify if user creation is successful. So basically what I am doing is I am sending a request to this endpoint API/1/users using the user object, and then I am checking if the response status is successful. Second is I am checking if the jot is written on successful login. So that is why I am calling this endpoint user credentials endpoint using post and passing that login details object, and then verifying if the response header contains the key by the name authorization, because the jot is returned as a value against the key named authorization. And then finally I am calling this method verify the tasks endpoint need jot. And in this method I am calling the API/1/tasks endpoint, which is protected by the jot interceptor, if you remember correctly. So if I am invoking the task endpoint without passing the jot here, then I will get an unauthorized response back. And for both the unit test and the integration test, we can simply run by clicking here. Both the unit and the integration test will run. So here the integration test will run. So the integration test will start the Spring Boot server. It has started the Spring Boot server, and then it will run each of the tests. So it has run all the tests, and it has run all the tests successfully. And also the unit test can also be run by simply clicking here. All the unit tests can be run. So I have just only created some representative unit and integration tests. This is definitely not the full set of unit and integration test. And in actual projects, we need to write all sets of negative tests to test all the boundary conditions. Remember, we definitely need to do that. I have not done that here because my purpose here was just to represent how we should create unit tests and how we should create integration tests in a Spring Boot application. But in your actual real life project, please ensure that you touch all the boundary cases, and your test should be much more exhaustive than this. So that's it more or less. You can also run the test, by the way. If you run a Maven clean package, it will by default also run the tests, and you can skip running the test by doing a Maven clean package -d skip tests. So just see that all the tests, all the unit and the integration tests are also being run from here. So that's it more or less. I hope you have been able to understand how we should write unit and integration tests in Spring Boot. And if you think I have delivered value, please go ahead and share this with your friends and subscribe, and please also provide your feedback on what else videos I can do and what are the other things which I can touch upon. So that will help me to tune my sessions accordingly. And thank you for your time once again, and have a nice day. Goodbye.